Technology, and especially social media, made possible through the internet, has put the world in touch in ways never before thought possible. But in doing so, some worry that it replicates the advantages and disadvantages that already exist in our globalized world. Ramesh Srinivasan is the founder of the University of California's Digital Cultures Lab, and his new book explores exactly that. It's called Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Shapes Our World. And he joins us now. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here in person,
You've
Steve.
been on this program before, but it was always through technology.
Exactly.
Not in the flesh. So it's nice to have you here. Amen. Whose Global Village? What does that refer to?
Well, in the 1960s, our good old fellow Toronto resident, Marshall McLuhan, had made the point that he thought the world would turn into a global village. So he was talking about and essentially prophesizing the internet, an electronic technology that would instantaneously communicate us all over the world, independent of where we were. So the idea was that would turn the globe into a village where we would all be connected, we would get to know one another, we could connect instantaneously. So that was the idea of a village, right? The idea of a village is one where everybody knows one another. There's an intimacy of connection.
But now you're asking whose it is.
Exactly. And my argument in the book is this is essentially, it's incredible how we have a world with about 4 billion people online, 4 to 5 billion people online, but the technologies that dominate that connectivity come from a very, very small part of the world. Actually, the same part of the world that I'm from and that I saw firsthand. And I'm talking about Silicon Valley and specifically the West Coast of the United States.
Well, you're taking quite a sort of counter the conventional wisdom view on this because, of course, I think most people thought that the internet and social media and a wired world would certainly level the playing field and make us all much more connected. But you're expressing fears that this could make the world much more undemocratic and unlevel. How come? Where do those fears come from?
Almost every empirical study, research study I've looked at actually shows that while the internet is not the cause of inequality, it actually amplifies inequality. It takes our existing inequalities and extends them and increases them. And the reason why are two major reasons. One is the platforms, the technologies that actually shape our experience of connecting and communicating with one another are dominated by black boxes that come out of Silicon Valley. So the vast majority of the money and power that is accrued through those transactions are actually accrued by investors and CEOs and engineers, of which there are very few in these companies. But the second reason is if you're wealthier or more powerful, you tend to have the skills already to best exploit the technology, right? So you can see how someone, for example, who might have some money, say, I was wealthy and you were poor, or you were wealthy and I was poor, your wealth would actually allow you to use the internet, for example, to make large-scale investments, right? And you could actually use the internet to your advantage disproportionately more than I would be able to. So these are two major ways in which inequality is extended economically, politically, we see the same story, and culturally, because these technologies are dominated by the West Coast of the United States and the ideologies and the belief systems of mainly, to be honest, white males.
Okay, but you give me that example, and then I'll give you an example back, which is the proverbial farmer in a field in the middle of let's say, Sri Lanka, who through the use of his or her cell phone is able to tap into information and possibilities that 10 years ago were seen impossible. So where's the unleveling in all of that?
So there are examples like that, and there's no question that an entrepreneur or a local farmer, per your example, can take advantage of technology. But on the surface, we find that the people that best take advantage of technology, even more so than the poorer people, are the people already at the top. So the issue here is not the specific projects where people or communities can use technology to support themselves. This book is full of examples of that. But it's making the argument, but we need to develop platforms, technologies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and Amazon even in its own way, that are more conscious of cultural difference and inequalities that exist.
What role do you think those brand names that you just mentioned have played in this phenomenon that you're describing?
Well, they're the cause of many of these issues that I'm explaining. And this is not necessarily me trying to point blame at them in a kind of
Sounds like a
well, I'm far more diplomatic than to try to do that in this direct a way. My goal is to actually reveal what's happening as a consequence of engineering that actually occurs in very small, myopic environments, right? And this is something that I too was complicit in, right? I'm a former engineer. I did my undergraduate at Stanford studying engineering. I went to MIT for graduate school. And I realized that as engineers, we often think of our technology projects as actually in a vacuum, in a box, right? But when these technologies migrate to other parts of the world, the reality changes, right? The reality actually is far more complex than we take into account. So when Facebook, for example, speaks of like the fake news problem in relation to like, you know, our wonderful election of 2016, they say, oh, this is a problem because the technology scaled so far in ways we couldn't control. But Facebook wants the technology to scale so far because that's why it's one of the most powerful companies in the world. So it has to actually connect with the communities that it actually serves and give them greater power over how Facebook might be used in those contexts or how Facebook might even be designed or developed. So we need to decentralize governance of design of technology.
Hold that thought. I want to get to what you want to do about it in a second, but I do want you to play it forward for us.
Yeah.
So go 20 years down the road. If the way it's been is the way it continues to be, what kind of a world do you see waiting for us in a couple of decades?
Rapid acceleration of inequality on many different levels, because you have to recognize that, you know, for example, when you go outside here at the studios, you can catch an Uber, right? And so an Uber is one example of a platform where none of the cars, none of the labor are necessarily contributed by Uber, the company, Uber, the CEO, or Uber's shareholders, right? So that's an example of what we see occurring, the atomization or fragmentation of labor. But this is only going to accelerate because you know what's next. And I'm not trying to be Mr. Doom and Gloom. I promise you, I'm just recognizing what's occurring and asking us to stem the tide is automation, automated vehicles. For example, I've noticed that Amazon has bookstores right here, right? Those bookstores are going to be powered by various forms of automation. Cars are going to be automated, automated vehicles. You know what one of the largest employers, and I think it's true in Canada as well, of people is in the United States or possibly in Canada are truck drivers, right? So these things are going to be outmoded. So we're going to have machines that are owned by these companies that are privately owned, replacing many forms of human labor and activity. And this is going to extend some of these dynamics of inequality. So while the book is primarily about kind of cultural and global issues, these issues are very, very relevant when we think about economic issues as well, which I think a lot of people can get around. So we need to develop policies and ways of thinking about labor and compensation that recognize the onset of artificial intelligence.
Ramesh, let's play a clip here because, well, Nicholas Negroponte is a guy you know well, another MIT guy, MIT Media Lab, and he did a TED Talk in 2006 on this program that he was developing, one laptop per child, which was going to be, I mean, theoretically, one of the great levelers in the world, figure out a way to get good, cheap laptops to kids who otherwise wouldn't have a shot at getting them. Sheldon, let's play this clip, then we'll come back and chat. Roll it, please.
A little bit more recently, I got involved personally, and sort of these are two anecdotes. One was in Cambodia, in a village that has no electricity, no water, no television, no telephone, but has broadband internet now. And these kids, their first English word is Google, and they only know Skype. They've never heard of telephony, okay? They just use Skype. And they go home at night, they've got a broadband connection in a hut that doesn't have electricity. The parents love it because when they open up the laptops, it's the brightest light source in the house. And talk about where metaphors and reality mix. This is the actual school.
Is there a difference in the way technology is used in the developing world that Negroponte was referring to there versus Silicon Valley, California, North America, whatever?
It's really striking in that clip that you showed. I'm really glad you showed it. I talk about it in the book, actually. How little responsibility or perhaps faith there is in the Cambodian people themselves. You know, there's this idea that teachers are somehow like, you know, excessive or unnecessary. The parents can't wait for the laptop's light to illuminate the house. Google is somehow some sort of like familiar or domesticated term that comes out of the Cambodian context, when we know none of those things are actually true. So there's no doubt there are profound differences in the ways people across the world, based on their constraints, based on inequality, use technology. That's why, to the point you made earlier about a farmer using technology to empower himself or herself or their community, that's a wonderful thing. But my point is that Google can't simply say we are solving people's problems when actually the lion's share of value is extracted from the farmer by Google.
What's Google's motto?
Don't be evil.
Right.
Yeah.
You think they are being evil?
I think some of these actions can have very negative consequences at the upshot of it all.
I don't have to tell you, you're spitting in the wind of a lot of conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom obviously paints a very rosy picture and a good story about how technology enables the world to do all sorts of stuff it otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And here's you, Mr. Doom and Gloom, painting this very cautionary tale about how we're all going to hell in a handcart instead because of it.
So let me promise
I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but just to provoke you a bit.
Let me promise you, Steve, this book is highly positive and optimistic, because it's basically arguing that these technologies that dominate the world, right? Google has over 2 to 3 billion users, which is almost 3/4 of the internet using population. Keep in mind, 700 million of those people are in China. So they're on their own internet, right? The intranet, actually.
Right.
Facebook is approaching the same numbers because Facebook owns Instagram and WhatsApp and Oculus and so on. So there's massive numbers of people. The point I'm trying to make is that those platforms are extracting so much power and so much value that it's not about a human using technology, it's about people buying into those black boxes, simply signing on to those terms of service. Like, let me give you an example. When you go onto Facebook or Instagram, what do you go on to view, Steve?
When I go onto Facebook, what do I go on to view?
Why do you log on? My posts, right? Or I go on to view your posts.
Yes.
Right, so the only value that's added necessarily, there's a value of the platform itself, and it should be recognized and compensated. But the other value of the platform, all the content is produced by us.
For free.
Uncompensated, exactly. Yes. And when we think about the extension of that into these various, artificially intelligent systems, which are basically only possible, I used to work on AI, it's only possible because there's better processing power, better computation, and the main reason is because all of us are all the time giving up our data in ways we don't understand.
But are you ignoring another side of the story, which is, and I know you're not, but I'm just trying to provoke you a bit here. Every time people gather in the streets of an authoritarian country in the world these days, it's called the Facebook revolution, because that's how people organize now. That's a key part of the story, isn't it? You don't think so? Go ahead. Go ahead. Let's go. Let me hear it.
You said that to provoke me.
Yeah.
So 3 years of my field work in the summers, to be completely honest, was spent literally in Tahrir Square. So you set me up really well with this one. And when I was out there, I found that people were not connected to these technologies, and people that were connected to these technologies were caught in bubbles. We use these words, bubbles, echo chambers, and so on. And they quickly realized that they represented such a small percentage of the population, and they were able to get people like me in the United States who was into what they were doing, like to join their Facebook groups. But how important am I really to their movement? So I am in my own way, but they basically realized that using social media, especially black box, top-down corporate social media, might actually be helpful in spreading your message to journalists and people like yourself and myself.
Or decision makers in Washington, D.C.
It could be, but it wasn't in that case. But at the same time, it may not necessarily be that helpful in organizing people. And so the vast majority of people that were protesting in that case were brought through other modes of connecting. So there's a sort of double-edged sword with thinking about social media as a catalyst for democratic activity or for protests. It can be helpful, but it shouldn't be like the temple we bow to, because there's all these other transactions, right? Anytime we go online, and actually anytime we're not even online, when we just simply carry our phone with us, there are a number of big data-oriented transactions that we're not aware of. And I'm asking for those companies to be more transparent to us, not just in the West, but also recognize the voices and values of the vast majority of the internet's users are not from Canada, they're not from the United States, even though the technologies come from here.
Well, let's follow up in this line of questioning then, because clearly we're not going to shut down the internet because you are worried about the negative consequences of it. So there does have to be a change if we're going to follow your line of thinking on this.
Yeah.
What do you see?
This is exactly what I'm writing about right now. I'm arguing for a new deal for the internet, thinking about some of the principles of the New Deal. I know that's a really that's an old New Deal, if you will, in the United States, but I'm thinking about it globally. So I'm thinking about how we need to think about labor in our future. We need to think about how people are going to be compensated, what kinds of jobs people are going to be doing, dignified labor. Make America great again is not good enough, right? That just means some sort of return to the past that we know is not going to happen. We need to think about a new digital economy that supports people first and their wages and their livelihoods. That's part one. Part two is users need to be educated, and we need to figure out ways in which those companies can work with us as users through what I call a social contract, right? There are examples of companies and businesses, I'm sure TVO is one of them, that work in a way that's very, very acknowledging of their consumers, of their users, right? So those companies and those users need to be aware of things like, what's happening with my data? Why am I seeing what I'm seeing? What else might I see? What data is being bought and sold about me? How are the advertisements that I'm seeing affecting my life? There are some things. I mean, some of them are more ambitious proposals, some of them are more realistic. And the third and most important issue, and related to this book, as well as the stuff I'm working on right now, is the kind of global community, the cultural question on things. So my point really here is that we need to get back to the idea of what a community is, instead of thinking that our social media profiles or our social media like accounts actually bring us community, when we know it's nothing like that. Mark Zuckerberg himself, CEO of Facebook, founder of Facebook, said, we know community is disappearing, but Facebook is not going to be a replacement for a community. What's happening in the United States, and in the Canadian case it might be somewhat different, is there's a profound distrust of institutions. People don't trust their communities, people don't trust media, and what do you think they do when they don't trust media or their communities? They go online, they go into their bubbles. So we need to think about internet technologies that support our communities. And this might sound like, wild-eyed liberal visionary here, or idealist, if you will.
No, but it does sound like it will require a level of political intervention that heretofore we have not seen.
We haven't seen, but I'm actually asking us to also remember that the internet that we see today is not the internet of 5 years ago. It's not even the internet of 10 years ago. In the late 1980s, I know it's a long time ago, there were no commercial transactions even allowed on the internet. It was completely non-commercial. And earlier histories of the internet, just 10 years ago, we saw platforms that are still around, like Craigslist, dominate things. Like Craigslist was not based on the kind of buying and selling of your data. It wasn't a black box. It made money, but it was peer-to-peer and community-based, right? Like I could log on to the Toronto Craigslist and buy and sell things.
Yeah, it's all there.
Or get a job, right? Those are community networks, and the internet started in that way. So I'm not saying we need to go back necessarily, but we need to think about a future that recognizes what we've lost with the internet that we see today.
Okay. Ramesh, we got about a minute left here. I want to read a little excerpt from the book and have you comment on that. It is incredible to think about what may be possible when we think about technology locally and culturally rather than globally. The question is one of values, control, and voice. We are at a point in time where we can either embrace diversity or ignore it. We can accept that the promise of a digital equality is unfulfilled. To accept these challenges, we need to stop, look, listen, and collaborate. Play it forward for us. How's this all going to work out?
I mean, it starts by these technology companies recognizing that they are disproportionately profiting. There's a triumph of capital over labor that we see occurring in the digital world. The wealthiest and most powerful people and companies in the world are increasingly tech giants. They need to be more socially responsible. But it also...
Who's going to make them, though?
We all have to, the interviews like this, I hope, are actually going to put a little bit of pressure on them to think about some ways they can open up in various ways. And the thing is, not everybody has to get into every issue that I've brought up. You only have to pick the issue that you actually care about. So related to the quote you just mentioned, the world is featuring, a lot of people might be into this, especially, I believe, Canadians. The world is featuring an astonishing loss of diversity, right? Not just biodiversity with climate change, but also languages, right? And cultures. And the internet is set up in this black box way where it's pro-Western English language dominated. When I search for material from other countries, I often get web pages that come from the United States. So this is not supportive of diversity. So the point I'm making in this quote is, with that issue, with diversity issues, with maybe issues around like what are my grandkids or even my children or myself in 10 years going to do for work, with issues around inequality, which is such a big issue in the United States, and I believe also in Canada. These issues, people can figure out which issue they care about. We can do various things. We can contact these companies. We can play with our digital media profiles. We can write op-eds. We can do what we want to do. And I also encourage entrepreneurs. They don't have to be nonprofit entrepreneurs to develop alternatives. And there are examples of that. So we need to think about ethical alternatives that force these companies that have dominated the internet landscape to actually not just mine our data like oil, but actually acknowledge that they, at the end of the day, are supposed to serve us as humans and the communities we're part of.
Whose Global Village? Rethinking how technology shapes our world. Ramesh Srinivasan. Good of you to join us at TVO tonight. Thanks, Ramesh.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.